So essentially, what we're looking at is our LaborAI solution. We have two versions of it. We'll call our standalone version, which is anybody that's got a warehouse or a consultant or somebody selling automation. They don't need to be connected to a WMS, so they can still get the same value.
Mhm.
And then we have our enterprise version, which is connected, which gives them more of a critical operational planning aspect where they can plan daily, weekly, hourly as such. Uh, so the way our software essentially works is you can build new files. Very simply, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up an existing file that we've worked with, um, and walk you through sort of the easy inputs for a client. Everything's color coded, so if it's blue, it's a mandatory field. If it's green, it's a calculated field. And if it's white, it's an optional field. So you can either put data in, or the software will actually create a calculation for that field. And if you want to override that, you can do that as well. Software runs in 18 languages, as well as imperial and metric. So essentially, we're starting here. We're telling you whoever the company is. We can pick the industry. One of the things we're doing is we're building a database of performance by industry. The company is, we can pick the industry. One of the things we're doing is we're building a database of performance by industry.
Mhm.
So we're doing all that. Now, inside of our tool, one of the things that we've done, which is somewhat different than other systems in the past, is that we've built a database of all the, we'll call it constants or human side of the engineering inside of our data table. So we've got a database on stepping on the fork, stepping off a fork, aligning the forks. And there's about 700 or 800 human constants that are involved in 30 touch points inside the building. We also have a database then of SKU characteristics, heights, weights, and cubes. We have a database of MHE equipment, liftoff speeds, accelerations, decelerations, and things like that. And then we layer that on top with a database of personal fatigue allowances and personal fatigue curves. And then finally, temperature and how temperature affects personal fatigue. So rather than going out and measuring a unique standard for a warehouse, we calculate it through a synergistic model. When we're creating our model, we ask the client to say, well, what target do you want to achieve? So in this particular case, at 85% of the standard, they're assuming that basically they want to be, they take out their 2 15-minute breaks in the day, and they want to achieve basically a 95% work standard with the breaks taken out. So this field is basically all you're doing is putting in your target, and then in your paid hours for the time period that we're looking. In this particular month, it was 157 hours based on the number of days that were in the month. So we'll come back to this sheet in a second, but this is just sort of our general side of things. Then what we do is we ask the client to put in the activity. How many cases are going out on pallets? How many cases come in on a pallet? How many cases are picked as units or just case picked? Some characteristics of the SKUs themselves, the weight, the size of the case, how many SKUs are actually in the building or in your pick line or your pick assignment. Some, we'll call it order profiling. So average lines per line or case. What's the Pareto on the SKUs in the building? And then what temperature band are you working in and how many orders did you have? What this does allows us to build up an activity model from a small sample set of data. Then what we do is you give me a little bit of averages of the way you handle the business. How many trucks or how many pallets come in on an inbound truck? Is it coming off the rear or the side? What's it look like when I'm receiving? Is it a full unit load? Is it mixed SKUs on a pallet? Or am I destuffing a container or hand stacking or unloading, cases off the back of a truck or something like that? Then you tell me how you're checking it, what's going on an outbound vehicle. When I'm putting it away, what goes away to reserve versus what goes to the pick face. And then within that, model what type of replens are we doing, one-way replens or two-way replens on an average, and then are we checking every single case that goes out? Are we shrink wrapping everything? How much is being courier or hand loaded into the truck and such? You see the green fields are calculated based on the numbers that we put in there. Our next tab, which is probably the most important, is you tell me the characteristics of the warehouse, the size of the warehouse, the size of the aisles, what type of pallets my standard pallet is I'm in the building, what's my average distances from receiving to put away and from picking to shipping, what we call our distance between SKUs. Do I have conveyance inside the building? What are my storage levels and things like that? And then lastly, what type of equipment we're using by each task. So in sense, it's not a lot of real heavy duty, call it data manipulation. There's 22 fields that are mandatory to get a model out. So if I'm a 3PL and I'm trying to build a work content model for a new client, I can get an accurate result with very little data. And that was sort of the genesis of the software, was be able to get an accurate decision going quickly. So once we filled out our models and we save our values out, we can then go and essentially we have a number of ways to view the results, but in our, we'll call it in our dashboard then calculates for us the activity that we've calibrated in that particular time frame. So there was 9,000 orders, there was 682,000 cases that went out on 8,000 pallets. And in this particular model, that equaled out at 85% of the standard. So in other words, based on our standards and everything that we've calibrated, you were required 3,810 hours to perform that. And in this particular case, the client was 83% or just under 2% of target, and they were probably at around 4,200 hours. Once we've got that sort of calibrated, we can then go and figure out what's my cost per unit, what's my performance on cases per hour per head count, what's my total head count required to do this amount of work for the customer. And then looking at each side of things, we can then figure out for 30 touch points of labor, what are my KPIs? So my KPIs can be measured in rate. So how many pallets per hour? We could look at the rate, how many minutes per pallet, or how many minutes per case or line that we're doing. We could look at how much activity there was. So there was 8,300 pallets that we received, and in full pallet picking or cases we went out, there was 682,000 cases that went out, but we only full pallet picked 29. So everything else was case picked, right? So we can figure out all of that. Then we can calibrate that out to a total number of hours that are required for each one of those touch points, or we could convert it to head count. So all of this is then calculated within the software, and then we have our costs. So the total cost for receiving, or do I want a cost per unit? So in this particular case, our average is 0.97 cents per pallet to receive a pallet. So displayed, we display this very quickly. We can see what the cost differential is. So they were out in that particular model, 90 hours differential from target. And for them, the cost differential based on what they're paying was around $3,000 in the month. And so the software does that very quickly without having to put an engineer out on the floor. So this typical model, this was created for a client who has a full-blown LMS system. They spent probably the better part of $300,000, and we got to the same result here within a day and a half on site to get this up and running for the client. If they want to look at sort of a more reporting type structure on that, our reports on this, we can look at the activity details. So how many pallets come in on the door versus full pallets versus hand stacking or checking, how many were checked, how many were palletized. And we do this for all the touch points. We build an activity model, not only on the SKU, but on the Pareto as well. So if it's a fast moving order, a large order versus a small order, you can see the Pareto on terms of SKUs that go out on the large orders versus the small orders and things like that. Then when we go back, we look at the model on the next report, we could then see the engineering behind it, which is telling me that our constant for every single pallet is 0.31 um, 0.31 minutes per pallet. But then when we put in the travel and the type of equipment we're using, we add over a half a minute to get to our standard of 8.76 minutes per pallet. But
Mhm.
on receiving or on put away aspect of it, you might see that that travel component's considerably higher. It's almost 3 minutes for the component versus the constant's only less than a minute on that. And that's how we get to 10 pallets an hour for put away. So in a sense, the software is doing everything that the engineer would do, but instead of building a unique average for that, we're actually averaging all that human elements and then adding in average distance and time and the type of equipment we're using. And
Okay.
so from an LMS perspective, we can get a system up and running with the client once the API is built inside of 5 days with very little services. That's just really to calibrate the API and to calibrate the first model. Then all they have to do is on a daily basis, they can hit the rerun model and then get a report each day that basically tells me these are my standards.
Mhm.
So my minute standard per pallet, my rate per hour, they get from their WMS, their WCS, or their ERP, the activity that is there for the day. And then
Mhm.
we would calibrate in that model how many hours are required for each touch point during the day, what
Mhm.
that equals in head count, what the costs are, and the cost per unit on a daily basis to get to this number that at the end of the day, we require, in this particular case, 8.7 people for the day, and it's going to cost us this much.
Mhm.
So that's sort of the hole that we're filling in the market right now that hasn't been adopted from an LMS system or from a WMS system, where the WMS systems are typically using just averages over time and there's no targets. And
Mhm.
then, of course, you've got blended rates in there and you've got peaks and valleys.